To Kill a Mockingbird, Chapter 3, Summary and Discussion. So Chapter 3 is where we get exposed to Atticus Finch's famous quote, "You never really understand a person until you consider things from their point of view." And so at this point, we haven't thought about any of the characters considering things from other characters' points of view, but we are told to look at that at the end of this chapter. And so the beginning of this chapter starts off with Scout putting Walter Cunningham's nose in the dirt. She's kind of trying to fight him outside. And then Jim shows up and tells her to stop. And then they realize that Walter Cunningham's father is friends with Atticus, and Atticus has helped Mr. Cunningham out several times. They realize that they're friends, and so they invite Walter to lunch at their house because Jim and Scout go home for lunch because Calpurnia cooks for them. And so Walter decides to go to lunch with them, and Atticus is there as well. He usually meets the children back home for lunch. Wouldn't that be nice if we could do that now? But, Walter, he asks for some molasses syrup while they're eating, and he starts pouring the molasses syrup all over his food. And Scout says, "What in the Sam Hill are you doing, Walter?" And she kind of calls him out. And Atticus is like shaking his head at Scout, like, "Please don't." And then she says, "But he's trying to ruin his food." And so she gets reprimanded for being rude to the guests. But the question is, why does Walter cover his food in molasses? Well, Walter is very, very poor, and he's not used to the molasses and the sweetness. And so it's a luxury item for him. Therefore, he is pouring it all over his food. And so Scout doesn't really think about life from his perspective. She just automatically calls him out on it. So after lunch, Scout and Jim go back to school. And Miss Caroline, we realize, is scared of a bug on a student's hair. Now, we're never specifically told what the bug is. It's referred to as a cootie. A lot of people say that it's lice because she tells Burris to wash his hair with lye soap. But yes, so the boy with cooties is Burris Ewell. And then we find out a little bit more about the Ewell family later in the novel. Later in this chapter, as Atticus talks about the family, and he says that they're allowed to hunt out of season, or Bob Ewell is. They don't have a mother. The father is contentious, etc. So we'll get to that in a minute. But Miss Caroline, she kind of reprimands Burris and tells him to go home, go wash his hair. And then he gets mad at her and says, "You know what? You don't have to tell me to go home. I was going home anyway." And so Burris is described as like a hulking individual, meaning he's kind of bigger than all the rest of the kids in the class. And there's a reason for that. It's because Burris should be in 3rd grade, but he's sitting in the 1st. So he obviously has skipped a few grades as he is in the 1st grade for the 3rd time. So Burris, he stands up and he gives Miss Caroline a few choice names and embarrasses her, makes her cry, and then he leaves. And then the children try to comfort her, and they say, "Oh, Miss Caroline, won't you read us a story about talking animals? That sure was nice this morning." And so she does. And so Jim and Scout go home, and then Scout talks about how her day went to Atticus, and she and Atticus have a long conversation on the front porch that night. And Atticus, this is when he tells her that you never really understand a person until you consider things from his point of view, until you climb into his skin and walk around in it. And so at this point, Scout realizes that she never considered things from Walter's point of view or Miss Caroline, and the fact that she's having to learn the culture of Macomb County. And her response to that is, "Well, I'll be dogged. She didn't know no better," is what she says. And then Atticus begins talking about how the Ewells are the disgrace of Macomb for 3 generations, because Scout says she doesn't want to go back to school because Miss Caroline told her not to read anymore. And she says, "Well, Burris Ewell doesn't have to go to school." And Atticus basically says, "Well, there's a reason why." And he begins explaining that the Ewells are the disgrace of Macomb for 3 generations. They haven't done an honest day's work. They live behind the town dump. And he basically says anytime, they want to learn, they can go to school and get an education, but they don't show any want to learn. He also says that the Ewells live in an exclusive society made up of the Ewells. They do what they want. There are some situations where the town people in Maycomb, they look the other way when they're breaking a law or whatnot. For example, Mr. Bob Ewell, Burris's father, he is permitted to hunt and trap out of season. And Scout says, that is so bad. We all know that that's illegal. And then Atticus explains to her that it is against the law, but when a man spends his relief checks on green whiskey, which is going to be like moonshine, his children have a way of crying from hunger pains. And then he goes on to say that he doesn't know of any landowner around there that begrudges those children any game their father can hit. So a lot of the people in Maycomb, they try to help the children by turning the other cheek and letting the dad just, hunt out a season to get food. And so Scout's having to consider things from Burris's point of view as well. And then towards the end of the chapter, Atticus and Scout make a mutual agreement that they'll go on reading every night if Scout will go to school every day. They agree. Atticus makes her promise not to tell Miss Caroline. And towards the end of this, Atticus is reading to Jim and Scout, and he's reading the newspaper about a man who sat on a flagpole for no discernible reason. So there was a fad going on then during this decade about people trying to break records and do things for a long amount of time. So I think the record for a man sitting on the top of a flagpole was 13 hours. And so that's what Jim and Scout are reading about. And so Jim gets this great idea that he can sit in his treehouse all day. And so Scout talks about how she runs errands for him back and forth, and she brings him food. And then Atticus says, Scout, if you don't pay any attention to Jim, he'll finally come out of his treehouse. And so Scout ends the chapter with saying Atticus was right. But Atticus wasn't just right about the treehouse. He was also right about understanding other people by putting yourself in their shoes. And so that is the main idea and theme from chapter 3.